Great. Thanks for joining us this evening. Kathleen Clausen and I are the co-chairs of ASIL's New Professionals Group. Our term is up in April of this year at the annual meeting, and so if you are interested in potentially taking over this role, you should come and speak to us or contact us. We have a great panel tonight, which is part of our Getting Started in International Law series. We have some resources on our website, and we're happy to provide you with more resources if there are things that you are specifically interested in exploring. To my right, we have Xander Meiza, an attorney with the International Litigation and Arbitration Practice at Foley Hoag. Then to the right, we have Sarah St. Vincent, Human Rights and Surveillance Fellow at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Annalise Fleckenstein, who is the counsel at the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, ICSID, and Brian Israel, an attorney at the Office of the Legal Advisor at the U.S. Department of State. I won't go into their bios, as you have a handy bio sheet right here. I'd like to ask them just a few questions. I'd like to ask them to respond fairly briefly, about 2 to 3 minutes, and then give you all some time to ask questions as well, and time for us to get to know each other. We have a couple of panelists who have to run afterwards, but if you're not able to speak to them and you would like to, I'm happy to put you in touch. So briefly, just starting out, we'll start with Xander and go down the line. Tell me a little bit about your current job and how it involves international law. And tell me not only about what your organization does, but what you specifically do and how your job involves international law.
So, as was said, I work for the International Litigation and Arbitration Practice at my law firm, so I work in the private sector. But that said, we in most of our work represent sovereign states. So one of the ways I describe what I do is sort of how there is an in-house counsel to a company, or the U.S. State Department has the Office of the Legal Advisor. We're the legal advisor for countries that might not have that kind of resource. And what that means is that we represent sovereign states in all kinds of disputes in U.S. federal courts, for instance, if they or their entities or officials or that kind of thing are in litigation. But we also do investment disputes, maritime disputes, border disputes, this kind of thing. We advise countries when they negotiate treaties, revise investment laws, you name it. If it's an international thing, including some of the very pure international law you may have learned about in law school, we do it. Now, what I do and what that means in real life is that I do a lot of work with treaties on a regular basis. I think Annalise might end up touching upon this, but when it comes to investment arbitration, very often our jurisdiction is through a treaty. So we will end up analyzing treaties, applying them, debating them, but also part of that process is we're going to be looking at domestic laws in foreign countries and how those work in those countries, how those other systems may interpret international law. So it ends up being at a lot of levels. And when it comes, of course, to maritime disputes or border disputes, if we're working with the International Court of Justice or that kind of thing, I mean, that's, you're working with negotiations between states, and so that other level of the international framework.
Hi, I'm Sarah St. Vincent. As Lisa mentioned, I'm the Human Rights and Surveillance Legal Fellow at the Center for Democracy and Technology. The Center for Democracy and Technology is a nonprofit that's based downtown, just a few blocks away. And CDT believes that the same human rights that apply offline should also apply online. And so we work in a variety of areas of basically internet and human rights. I work on the security and surveillance team, and my job is to focus on the basically NSA surveillance from an international law perspective. And so it is a lot of fun. I'm doing this largely through law reform and policy advocacy rather than litigation, although I have some background in human rights litigation. I'll talk about that a little bit later, probably. A couple of things that I do. Through CDT, or CDT has me do this, I lead a coalition of NGOs such as, not just CDT, but the Electronic Frontier Foundation, ACLU, Open Technology Institute, companies such as Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and also trade associations to reform FISA Section 702, which is the legal provision that underpins some of the really, really sweeping NSA surveillance programs that you've probably heard of, such as PRISM or Upstream, that grab millions of people's communications, people both within the US and outside it. And so I have the chance to lead that reform coalition, which is really incredible. I also write what are called third-party interventions, basically amicus briefs in European Court of Human Rights cases that raise surveillance issues. Particularly a case against Hungary that was just, the judgment just came out yesterday, 2 days ago, Really interesting. I would recommend looking at that, and also cases against the UK. I analyze European Court of Human Rights and also Court of Justice of the EU developments, other EU law developments. And I've also done some UN advocacy work, writing shadow reports, going and doing advocacy in Geneva with states' missions, particularly around the Universal Periodic Review process that the Council does for each state about every 4.5 years, again, focusing on surveillance issues. And then finally, within the organization, I am lucky to be a kind of general counsel of sorts for international law. They wouldn't call me that, but I am fortunate that my colleagues tend to refer really interesting international law questions to me. Things like, can the Justice Department get a warrant to compel Microsoft to turn over data that it holds in Ireland? And what does that have sovereignty implications? Yes. And just kind of getting to answer really interesting questions like that. So my job is about maybe 75 to 85% international law, and I really enjoy it very much.
Hi, I'm Annalisa Fleckenstein. As Liesl mentioned, I work at ICSID, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. We're one of the 5 agencies of the World Bank, and there I am legal counsel. And what we do is we provide a neutral forum for investors and states to bring claims that arise out of investments. And they bring these claims based on bilateral investment treaties, UNCITRAL clauses, NAFTA, CAFTA as well, and also contracts between investors and states. And when a case comes to ICSID, we are assigned as secretaries of the tribunals, and we provide throughout the case procedural assistance to parties and tribunals. We assist them as well. We do technical assistance when they want, when they have hearings on their cases. We provide this assistance. And basically, we were created as part of the World Bank in order to provide this neutral forum for investors and states to settle or to negotiate their investment claims. So we do have a lot of cases with Foley Hoag that bring cases to ICSID on the part of states, basically.
Hi, I'm Brian Israel. As Liesl mentioned, I work at the State Department in the Office of the Legal Advisor, which is affectionately known within the building as L. And L is divided into roughly, I think, 23 different offices that sort of track the overall organization of the State Department. So for the last 4 years or so, I've worked in the Office of the Legal Advisor for Oceans, International, Environmental, and Scientific Affairs. And within that office, I'm responsible for some broad geographic domains, like the Arctic region or outer space, for example. But also thematic areas, science and technology, the intersection of international human rights law and the environment. So what does this mean practically? It's probably the only job I know of where you can have your morning filled with, on the one hand, meetings about the subsistence harvest of polar bears, and then meeting with companies who want to mine asteroids. I think sort of more generally at a higher level, I spend a lot of my time counseling a wide variety of both clients within the State Department and across the executive branch, but also other stakeholders on the application of, you might say, of old law or old treaties to new technologies and capabilities that were unprecedented and sort of not contemplated by sort of well-established international legal frameworks, but not just being sort of an active or rather a passive participant in interpreting them, but also engaging with foreign states, both bilaterally and in multilateral fora in the UN, to adapt these international legal frameworks to address contemporary challenges, opportunities, capabilities, and the like. Another major part of what I do, I've described before as engineering international cooperation, and particularly international environmental cooperation. A number of environmental challenges require, either inherently require cooperation on a global scale, as is the case with climate change mitigation, or on a more regional scale. Lawyers in this role, I think, are integral in helping states to that want to cooperate collaborate on a solution to structure that, to arrive at some kind of efficacious cooperative outcome. And I've described it by analogy to engineers because I think that lawyers in this role sort of earn their pay by being able to really weigh the sort of design advantages and disadvantages of, say, legal mechanisms on the one hand, treaties and other international agreements, versus legally non-binding political mechanisms, and really understanding how these will work together and facilitate or not facilitate the kind of cooperative outcomes we're trying to achieve. More practically, on a day-to-day level, the functions that it involves are varied, from client counseling to a lot of negotiation with foreign governments bilaterally, multilateral negotiations, negotiations with other agencies in the executive branch, quite a lot of negotiation.
Great, thanks. All right, let's briefly kind of 2-minute answers, and we'll start this time with Brian and come back toward me. How did you prepare for this career? What was key to your preparation? How did you get started in international law? 2 minutes each, please.
Well, I went to law school with this job in mind, and so I got lucky in that regard. And I took quite a few classes in international law, and was editor of an international law journal and that kind of thing. The most important, the only good advice I've heard for getting a job in the Office of Legal Advisor in particular is to work there as a student, and that's what I did. I spent the last semester of my 3L year working in the Office of Legal Advisor for Human Rights and Refugees. And there's two pathways to working there as a student. One is as a summer intern, your 2L summer, and the other is a semester extern, which if you're at law school here in DC is a unique opportunity available to you. If you look up practicing law in the Office of Legal Advisor in the search engine of your choice, it'll lead you to a page that has all the information on how to do that.
Great, thanks.
I was just always interested in international law. I actually, my background is I was born and grew up in Venezuela with foreign parents. So I went to law school in Venezuela. And there, my second year, there's a public international law course, and I really liked that. So in my third and fourth years, I participated in the Jessup competition. And so that really opened I met a lot of people in the field, and it really got my interest going. So then when I was done there, I came to the U.S. to do an LLM at George Washington University. And then through the dean of the international law section, I was able to meet somebody at ICSID, and they actually needed somebody to fill in for one of their lawyers for a few months. So I did that because I had also the English-Spanish background that they needed. And then 8 years later, I'm still there. So
my path was a little bit more winding. I started out, I just grew up with a long-standing interest in Vietnam and in the Vietnam conflict, and I went on to do a master's in East Asian Studies at Harvard. But shortly before I started my master's degree, the Abu Ghraib scandal broke, and I came to realize that what really interested me was state abuses of power. And so the explosion of the national security state in this country, if you want to put it that way, happened right around the time when I was trying to decide whether I wanted to go to law school. And so I started interning for a place called Physicians for Human Rights in their campaign against torture, looking at whether and how psychologists were involved in developing what are called enhanced interrogation practices, so basically abusive interrogation practices. I also went to law school with basically this job in mind, and I would say I got here largely by taking the classes I wanted to take and being lucky enough to have it all work out. I loved international humanitarian law. I took international criminal law, a couple of human rights courses, refugee law, really a mix. And then I had the immense good fortune of getting an international Skadden Fellowship, so a regular Skadden Fellowship, but in the UK out of law school. I worked at a place called the AIR Center, the Advice on Individual Rights in Europe Center, where I helped immigrant women in the UK to assert their rights under the European Convention on Human Rights and EU law, usually so that they could get the kinds of benefits that would keep them from being destitute and on the street. And so it was an incredible opportunity to use international law, international human rights law, with clients, and especially with very vulnerable clients. And I enjoyed that very much. After that, I was at the International Court of Justice as what's called a university trainee. It's basically a clerkship for 9 months with 2 judges And then this job came up, and I had actually not heard of CDT at the time, but I looked at it and I thought, wow, human rights and surveillance, this is exactly what I would love to do. I was fortunate enough to have a law school friend who worked there, and so I got to learn a bit about the organization, applied, and here we are.
I already fear that I'm going to be talking very fast to make it in my 2 minutes.
So 2.5.
Oh, thank you. So I always knew I was interested in international relations or international law, and I went to college initially at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. I was an international security major, and then decided that I really wanted to do. I wanted a liberal arts degree and not a BS degree. And so I transferred to Dartmouth, where I was a religion major. But what was my thesis on? The disintegration of Yugoslavia and how and how politicians use religion to fuel conflict. And what I was very interested in was conflict and how to resolve conflicts. And I spent time doing field work in the former Yugoslavia. After undergrad, I worked in Albania for a year. I then worked in international political development. I should say, while in undergrad, I worked for the State Department at 3 different posts abroad. I cannot say enough about how fabulous it is to work as a student at the State Department. I downloaded an application off the internet. You too can get an internship. It is possible. But all of those things sort of led me to a conclusion of, as much as I want to resolve conflict, wouldn't it be better to prevent it? And I became very interested in economic development, because economic development often brings peace with it. So I went to law school thinking I was going to do project financing and economic advising and that sort of side of things. And during one of my summer jobs, I stumbled upon international arbitration, and I had no idea such a thing existed. Law schools didn't offer that many courses in it. I hadn't really heard about it. But all of a sudden, I found myself doing work where I was like, wait, I get to do treaties in a law firm, and I get to talk about international law all day. I was very excited. So that's sort of how I kind of stumbled upon this by accident, by luck. And I was very grateful for it. 8 years later, I'm still doing it. I've done it at 2 different law firms. I also have clerked the Extraordinary Chambers of the Courts of Cambodia. And I also clerked on the First Circuit Court of Appeals. But all of those things influence my job now. And one thing I also will say that has greatly influenced my job now is all of the international experiences I have had, whether as a student, as a worker, as a traveler, all of those things. And that's something that you don't have time for or you don't have as much time for, shall we say, once you actually start practicing law. So if you're in law school and have an opportunity to study overseas or spend time working overseas, I would strongly recommend it.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for those responses. Here's a general question that any of you can answer in any order you like. With the exception of Xander, who spent a year at the First Circuit Court of Appeals, none of you really have, as I understand, kind of U.S. lawyer or Venezuelan lawyer experience. What do you think about that? Would you have liked to have had that? Would that have made it more difficult to enter the field of international law? What are everyone's thoughts on that?
I'm still thinking, do I have no U.S. lawyer experience? So in truth, a fair amount of what we do in the Office of Legal Advisor at the State Department is practicing U.S. law, particularly as we're responsible for implementing the international obligations of the United States, and that requires bringing in our international obligations into our domestic legal system. As far as whether sort of a more traditional or domestic law practice would have opened doors in this practice, I'm not sure that it would put you at any special advantage in getting a job there or in practicing there, but most of my colleagues do come to the State Department with several years of experience, particularly law firm experience, and so that is the more traditional path. And I think any legal experience or professional experience, for that matter, can be of value in this.
Great.
I agree. Although I didn't practice as a lawyer once I graduated, I did do what they're called, you work while you study in law school. So you basically do the work of a junior lawyer, but as an intern and for less pay. But I think it is helpful to practice law at least for a couple of years, at least once you've graduated. It gives you, I think it gives you that expertise maybe that you have, you go afterwards to the international law field, but it gives you that background of domestic law. I know, for example, a friend of mine who does investment arbitration found her the job at the law firm she's at because they had cases against Venezuela and they needed her particular expertise in administrative law, and so that she had already practiced for a few years, and that really did help her. So I think it is. I mean, if you have the chance to do it, I think it can't hurt you. Let's say I think that would really help.
I find it to be a double-edged sword. I think that at least in the human rights field, and perhaps in international law, you kind of public interest in international law, if you like, so international criminal law as well. Organizations and courts, for example, tribunals, often want you to have international law experience. And that's hard, so you need to get that. But once you've gotten that, it can be hard to then go back to the domestic context. So many of these places also really like to see things like law firm experience or practice experience so if you're trying to get to one of the international criminal tribunals, experience as a prosecutor or as a public defender or a defense attorney of some kind is really invaluable, and many of those positions actually require it. And so I would say it's hugely advantageous to have both. I wouldn't change anything about my own path, but I do think it's hugely advantageous to have both, but it can be difficult to get both I'm 5 years out of law school, so my experience is a little bit limited in this respect. But I do have some regrets about not having done a federal clerkship. I think that the ICJ clerkship was incredible, but I think that you do yourself a service when you get some litigation experience in the United States.
Yeah, I agree with the double-edged sword assessment, but I would also say I think that the skills are absolutely invaluable, because the skills that you learn as a lawyer working in domestically are skills you're going to apply in whatever that you're doing. So for instance, okay, I do international arbitration before ICSID. What are we doing in that? We're filing motions. We don't call them motions. We file letters. We file briefs. We don't call them briefs. We call them memorials or reply or this, that, and the other thing. But what we're doing is writing. We're researching. We are, having these communications with opposing counsel. We're having depositions. Again, we don't call them depositions. Just because they have different names doesn't mean it's not, in many ways, the same thing. So while I understand many people want to start out right away going right into international law, if you find yourself in a position where you're doing domestic work, think about it as, what skills can I gain now that I can use later? And when you want to try and transition into something internationally, think about your skill set and think about that as that's what you communicate. I can write really well. Everyone wants you to write well. It is truly a skill. It is something that needs to be practiced and learned, except for the few that are just God-given with the talent, and I wish I were one of those people. But that's the kind, that's to be something that you might want to keep in mind if you find yourself, I really wanted to do this or that, but now here I am, and I'm just reviewing contracts in my office without windows all day. You're not just doing that. Think about what skills you're gaining and how you're going to spin this. Like one of the guys from Mad Men, you're advertising yourself. So think about what your brand is and your pitch, but on a skill level, what you're learning, because those skills really do matter.
I think I would agree with that. I never considered a clerkship because I wanted to go straight into international law, and I think I would have benefited from having that experience. I think I see that experience is desirable to many different employers. Please come on in and join us. Grab a seat wherever you like.
By the way, to be clear, I did not clerk out of law school. I didn't even consider it. It wasn't on my radar. And then I was working at a firm, and I realized after talking to people who clerked, I'm like, that sounds really interesting. And oh, wait, look at all this writing skills that you get, and look at the experience of seeing that perspective of the judge, or, that's something that's very helpful when then you're an advocate. So I did an untraditional route and had worked for 3 or 4 years as a practicing attorney, and then went to clerk, and then went back into private practice. So that's also a possibility.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Okay, starting here with Xander and working back down, could everyone tell me 1 or 2 pieces of advice that you would have liked to have received when starting out your career in international law, or something you wish you had known?
I gave you the one about overseas already, so I will say this. Language skills, you won't have time for it later. You may try, but it's much harder. So for anyone still in undergrad, take those language classes now. If you're in law school and you have an option to take a language class, or again, to be able to practice your language skills in a legal setting, I highly recommend that you do it. Because also there's one thing about knowing a language, and there's another thing about knowing the language enough to practice law in it. And that's a very different level of proficiency, but a very valued skill to have, and one that will make you very marketable. And not just marketable, you will find more interesting assignments and more interesting opportunities if you have it. So I wish I had known that then.
As the person who still, about every other year I go, I am so frustrated that my French is not, it's just not there. And so I take classes at the Alliance Française, and then, another year goes by and it's like, man, I'm so frustrated that my French is just not there. And this has gone on for a really long time. So yeah, I think that's really fantastic advice. I think it's really valuable if you get the chance, and this is actually, I suspect this is quite hard to do outside of the European systems, but if you get the chance to work with vulnerable people in communities, I think that serves you really well throughout your career, because you have a good sense of how the law, whether it's international law or domestic law, affects people's lives. And I say that not to be preachy, but because I think that, especially if you're thinking about human rights, seeing the impact on the ground, it just makes you much more knowledgeable, it makes you more credible. And there's also just something about the experience of doing client counseling, of doing litigation, of writing the statement of facts, of everything that comes with actually working with human clients. I think gives you a valuable perspective and good experiences. So I would say, and also, many of those jobs sometimes are lower paying, and so fresh out of law school is a really good time to do them. When maybe your life obligations are a little bit less. And I think also, this is going to sound very self-helpish, but I'll just go for it. I think it's good to be honest with yourself about who you are and what you want. I, coming out of law school, did not want to work for a law firm. And I did go through a crisis, during early interview week when everybody's running around going, law firm. And I thought, should I be doing this? I didn't want that. And same time coming out of law school, I didn't want a clerkship. And I think that was the right decision for me. And so I think it's good to think about, do you want to be doing client work? Are you happy, just analyzing contracts? Some people actually really do enjoy that. Are you the kind of person who wants to be doing policy analyses, or are you a litigation person? Just be kind of honest about what you enjoy. And then finally, I think for the women in the room, I think it's helpful to acknowledge the reality that international law, at least in my experience, remains a very male-dominated field, and that comes with certain challenges. And for me, it's been very helpful to find good, strong female role models. One of my judges at the International Court of Justice was Judge Shui, originally from China, and I think that it can mean a lot to have people like that professionally who you can look up to. Not even necessarily that you go to them for guidance about this, but that you can just see that it is possible to make it, it is possible to stay sane, and that you have a very bright future.
Yeah, I agree with the language as well. I mean, I agree with everything, but I agree with the language. I think now also I think soon it'll be a necessity to speak 3 languages very well, because so many people now speak 2 languages at least. So in the field, at least at our offices, most people speak at least 3 languages. So I think it is very important. Also, I kind of asked my colleagues to see what advices they would want to receive as well, and the consensus was that a lot of young professionals don't know about all the opportunities that are out there. For example, one of my colleagues didn't know at the time that you could clerk at the ICJ. So really, if you're interested in something, research it, or talk to the professionals in the field. They might have ideas that that might be useful to you. I think that's very important. And nobody ever told me, but I mean, obviously, as a natural consequence of this field, it's very multicultural, and that can be very difficult to work with as well. You come with your culture, with your understanding of things, and then you go into this field and you encounter somebody from a completely different culture. It's hard to work with people that you don't understand what their where they're coming from and what their views are. So I think that's always important to keep in mind. And so part of that, to understand this would be traveling. If you're able to travel and to take internships and different assignments abroad, that's very important because it will help you in your career.
So this is all great advice on breaking into the field, becoming an international lawyer. I'll try and give you a couple things to keep in mind for when you become international lawyers. One of them that I guess doesn't seem surprising to me now that I think of it, but was nevertheless surprising to me, is the extent that, at least in my role, a fair amount of what I do is not just sort of ascertaining whether there's an international legal rule or the content of that rule, but trying to persuade others of the relevance of that rule to the issue at hand. And I think much more than in a domestic law context, there will always be many people, sometimes most people, who will question the relevance of international law to the issue at hand, or more particularly, whether there's any practical consequences of noncompliance that we should care about. And so I think it's important to be aware of this in your advice, in your advocacy, and no matter what your role, I think it's important to be able to advise holistically on the practical consequences of compliance or noncompliance with the rule, recognizing that different actors will care to varying degrees about it. A given company might not care so much about sort of the international reputation of the United States, or sort of the value of a sort of rule-based international order, but they might want to know about who does care within the government and the like. The other thing is to keep in mind that international law is at least as I view it, is a means to many ends, but it's not necessarily an end in itself. And I think that particularly groups of international lawyers looking at a problem can sometimes lose sight of that. And I think there's a tendency to sort of favor legal mechanisms, even where those aren't necessarily optimal in a given situation. And I think that one of the most important roles of an international lawyer is to really understand the advantages and disadvantages of legal mechanisms versus other non-legal mechanisms for any challenge you're trying to confront, and to be able to advise on that. And that's as much maybe a social science inquiry as much as it is a legal one.
Great. Anyone want to react or add anything to that? Okay. I would also second the networking, which I think someone brought up, and I'll come back to you in just a moment. I think it's important to maintain a network, to understand what's out there, understand career possibilities that you didn't know existed, to be able to have people to turn to for advice when you come to a fork in the road and you're not sure which way to go. And as you're growing and developing and looking for opportunities for your organization, which will advance your career as well. Did you want to add something, Xander?
I hadn't, but now you just gave me an idea.
Raised your hand there.
Which is the be nice.
Yeah. Yes.
Always be nice.
Yes. And yes.
And be nice starting in law school, be nice.
Yeah.
Because guess what? 10 years later, 20 years later, you keep running into those people.
Yeah.
And they will remember that time that you took that book and then didn't give them notes or whatever. But really, be nice. The world of international law is very small. You will meet this person again.
Yes, definitely.
It's a long game, not a short one.
Yeah, and more than networking, because I always disliked that term because it seemed like you had to meet people because you're only interested in what they're doing, and be interested in what people in the field are doing. Even maybe that's not exactly what you want to do, but you might make friends or meet other people through that person that you're interested in. Think of it that way. Don't think of it only as, I have to meet networking. Oh, I'm not quite interested in what you're doing. Let me go to the next person. Be interested in people and what they're doing.
Right. Maybe it's better to say form relationships and keep up those relationships. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll ask one last question and then open it up to the floor. So all of you are lawyers, but you're also diplomats and negotiators and scholars and many more things. Tell me something else that may not be obvious that you do to develop your skills in your careers. Is there your journal that you must read, or your blog that you must read, or your professional society that you really think is valuable, apart from the American Society of International Law, obviously? Let's see. Let's start with Xander and work down.
Oh goodness. I will say, and this is not just because we're in this room, but ASIL really is a great organization, and you should stay with it. And you can learn a lot. There are some really cool people here. You'll meet very interesting people at the conferences. Don't be intimidated when you see these people that may have their picture on the brochure. Inevitably, in my experience, when I've gone up to try and talk to somebody, rarely has anyone ever said no. So go ahead, introduce yourself to the person next to you, even if it's to say, I'm so nervous, I can't believe I'm here. What are we supposed to talk about? But do it. And so ASIL really is helpful. Other things that I do, I read a newspaper every day. I will admit it's not in print anymore. I read it online. But it's amazing how many times I find my clients in the newspaper, but also it's just really good to know what's happening in the world, and also to have something to talk about other than, oh, have you seen article such and such of the such and such constitution that just came out? No, you have lives other than your job, so make sure that you have some time for that. Besides, it'll make you better conversationalists when you're talking with people and networking. But I would say that just keep reading and reading and reading in your job and reading for fun, and that kind of thing.
I am a novelist, actually, outside of what I do, and by that I mean novel number 1 is sitting in my pajama drawer, and I hope that novel number 2 will make it as high as my sock drawer, and then maybe someday it'll make it out into the world. But as part of that, I read, and I read in the sense of that other job that I hope to have someday. I read out of professional interest. I read. And in fact, I do something rather dodgy, which is just go into Kramer books, see what looks interesting, and then go on my mobile and look it up on the library website and request it, and not pay for it. And I think that that just kind of small C Catholic reading, just read anything you're interested in. I think it's not only useful for forming connections with people, but it helps me in my job. I read The Guardian obsessively, but also just kind of, I don't know, just whatever interests you. Like reading about early 20th century history has helped me to learn about earlier iterations of U.S. mass surveillance programs. I got really interested at one point in Emma Goldman, who was this early 20th century anarchist. I see a few heads nodding, and surveillance programs that were adopted partly in response to people like her. I'm trying to think. My second novel concerns somebody who joins a militia, which seemed really obscure when I started it about 12 months ago. But now all of a sudden, the far right is actually a really hot legal issue and social issue. And so I think just that kind of, I know this is really cliche, this is very obvious, but just being curious and just, again, reading what you enjoy, doing what you enjoy, makes you a better rounded person, it makes you a better lawyer.
I'm going to cheat and say something before it goes to you, which is that, yes, I mean, do things that you want to do and that are fun to you, because fun shouldn't be work. So to the extent that you read, that you're interested in something, go ahead and do that. It's okay. You're allowed to do that, and you'll be happy about doing it.
Yes, I second that. I obviously read certain journals and articles that are in the investment arbitration world just to keep up with what's going on in the world, in that world that I'm in. But I also read like ASIL Insights when you get ASIL Insights to kind of go a little bit broader. I try to read the newspaper every day, but sometimes don't have time. And I do like to read. I read novels as well. I do like to read novels or biographies, anything that is completely different from what I do at work. I really like that because I also think it gives me something to talk about with other people as well. It's reading. As lawyers, that's what we do. It's important.
So I'll also endorse reading, although I spend a lot of time reading scientific literature, in part because so much of my job is interdisciplinary, working with marine scientists, for example, or occasionally rocket scientists. I don't necessarily understand what I read, but I read nonetheless, and also because it's fascinating, and part of what I need to be able to do is understand, at least on a functional level, the basic science, but also be able to relay my legal analysis to scientists and engineers and the like. I think one thing that's helped me be a better international lawyer is teaching, and particularly adjunct teaching international law. And apart from having a sort of keeping abreast of broader developments in the field beyond what I happen to be working on, I think just the act of teaching has helped me to structure and present my thoughts in multilateral negotiations or that kind of thing. So that wasn't something that I sort of planned to do, kind of just fell into once I started the State Department, but I think has made me a better international lawyer overall.
You mentioned organizations.
Sure.
I wanted to just say that there are some great organizations, Women in Arbitration, the Women in International Law group within ASIL, Women in Mining. There is such a group. I do a lot of work with mining. But there's not just groups about women. But the point being that there may be a specialist group out there that's related to your area of law or maybe an area of interest. And on the mentoring front, that can be a great way to find a natural mentor. So that's something to keep in mind.
Great. Okay. Anyone have a question out there? Let's see. I don't know if we have a microphone, so I'll just kind of. Okay. I'll just stand up and pass it around.
My question is actually about what you were all just saying about reading. Are you, aside from the novels, are you actually doing this reading at work? Because I'm trying to figure out, I mean, I am a lawyer, but I'm not practicing, and I'm in the Army, and reading at work is not okay. So I'm just curious about whether you are actually like fitting this in at midnight, or how you actually fit it into your day, and is this kind of reading to advance your career kind of considered part of your work day? Because that would be a relief.
If I may, the novel reading I do at home right before I go to bed. I read a few pages, or in the metro when I'm on my way to work. I take advantage and I read. Other reading, for example, like, articles on investment arbitration or things like that, I do at work. Sometimes, you're there for 9-10 hours. There's some time I take 20 minutes out and I'll read an article just to take a break from what I'm doing. But we get it in our work email, so I consider it part of the job, because it keeps you current on what you're doing.
I would say, I'm working on a U.S. national security issue, and so my obsessive Guardian reading, if anybody doesn't, if it's a UK paper, it's also a U.S. page, it's free, it's amazing. It's like the New York Times, free. So I do that as part of my job, because keeping up with the news and current events broadly is part of what I have to do. And I think that's actually one of the wonderful things about the job, is that it makes me keep up with these things. More leisure reading, no, I actually get up early to do that kind of thing, to do the reading and the writing that I do in my off time, and I find that it's well worth it.
Yeah, I have, part of my routine is when I get into my office in the morning, I have my cup of coffee. Size varies depending on sleep deprivation, and while that is being consumed, I will read the paper online. Like New York Times, Guardian is great. Al Jazeera, which I'm so sad is now going out of business, at least in the U.S. But yes, I go through that, and that's at work. And I get a ton of email on a daily basis related to work. ASIL Insights, a publication called GAR, which is Global Arbitration Review. There's a whole list of publications that are practice specific that come in, and it's part of my job to keep up with those developments. Not just because they may not mention my clients, but it may be issues that are related to cases that are pending. Mm-hmm. And one thing about international law as opposed to domestic litigation, there's not a Lexis for us. So part of how we find out what's happening and what's the latest is by keeping up with those publications. So I don't get to bill it to a client, but it's considered part of my obligations of my job to read it. I can't spend all day, right. but I do try to keep up when I can. But then I contrast that with when I'm on airplanes, I read magazines like In Touch, which I've now just admitted on a video, dime store mystery novels, because my brain needs a break every once in a while. So,
actually, if I could just add to that, Twitter. I'm not on Twitter, but in my field, that's actually how most people get their news. And so, in my job, it would actually be completely legitimate to be spending, not an hour, but half an hour a day on Twitter, because since there is no Lexis or Westlaw, you have the LIIs, the LII websites, which can be useful for foreign law. But yeah, this is how many of us get our news. There is no centralized site where I can find out that this really important European Court of Human Rights judgment came out. And so Twitter is actually how most of us get this stuff.
Yeah. On Facebook too, if there are different entities like the International Criminal Court or other international things where if you like them, then they'll populate your feed with articles and breaking news. And again, that's where I end up finding out a lot of stuff before it comes out in a more formal publication.
It's a great way to justify being on Facebook all day. All right, another question.
Hi, thank you for coming. You've kind of just touched on it, but how do you keep yourself sane and a person, you're always on lawyer mode. I mean, most of the time you're at work. So how do you create that work-life balance?
I would say I'm fortunate enough. I'm not in a law firm, and I didn't want to be in a law firm. I decided that's not what I wanted. So we do work a lot at ICSID, and there are sometimes when there are very long hours, but we are able to maintain a balance. So I'm able to leave, between 6 and 8. So that allows me to get home, have dinner, be with my son, do what I need to do. And then weekends, occasionally I'll have a hearing that I have to go to, or I have I have to finish something and I'll do it. But most of the times I have the weekends to myself and my family. So that's how I balance it.
Everyone's looking at me.
I have a 20-month-old daughter, which sort of forces work-life balance in the best possible way, and I think creates insanity in some ways and detracts from it, subtracts from it in others. Before I had a child, I think I was in this job. I think I was on the road 2 to 3 weeks a month, which was exciting in some ways and really wears you down in others. But I found just having a family helps you to sort of, really just forces you to have that balance and to become more efficient in what you do and figure out what's really necessary and what's less so.
It's amazing what you can do when you have kids. It's amazing just how efficient you become because you want to get home to them.
Although less reading at night.
Yeah, 2 pages.
For me, this is the trade-off. So when you work for a nonprofit, you earn less, but you have more time to yourself. And one thing I've done, I worked in Europe for 3 years, and in Europe, unless you're in finance, your weekends are your weekends, your evenings are your evenings. You are not expected, and your vacations are your vacations. And I've tried to bring that here as well, and draw those lines and say, unless something is truly urgent, I'm not working out on the weekend, I'm not working out in the evening. And I'm lucky to have an organization where there are some people who are on their email around the clock and who want to be working around the clock. My boss is one of those people, but he's understanding enough, I'm not forced to do that. And I think that for me, it has been a combination of drawing the lines and then being in a place where that's respected, in part because it's an international organization. We have a Brussels office. We have someone who's based in London. And so there's a mixing of cultures there that helps us to all cabin in this. And in terms of staying healthy, it's about, I suppose, building your own life outside of it, whatever it is that you enjoy doing that's not work.
It's hard. Yeah. I would like to tell myself I've gotten better at it, but there are days where I have to remind myself that I need to be better at it. I try and make sure that one day of my weekend is mine, and that I get out of the house and I see friends, or I do something that has nothing to do with law. I will admit to really liking very bad monster movies. Nothing to do with law, and that's great. Because as much as I absolutely love my job and the substance of what I do, I need to have my brain not always doing that. But a couple years ago, I basically decided I'm going to take my one day a week, and that might mean that I work much later on a Friday night, or I work more on Sunday, but having my Saturday to me, because rarely does something actually have to be done that day. When it does, it does. That has made a huge difference. So it's amazing what a small difference can make. I also will put a plug in, which your doctor would probably also recommend, which is going to the gym or doing some sort of activity outside, I would just say. And walking to the metro would not count if you're commuting to work. For years, I told myself that counted, but it doesn't necessarily count because, again, just putting yourself in a different space, it can be very, very helpful.
Actually, if I could just add something very short to that. I bike to work, for example, which is slightly crazy to do in DC, and I'll be the first to admit that. But
that counts more than one.
Yeah, it's a bookend to the day. But I think also, this is fairly small, but I've learned to take my vacation in chunks, not just a day here or there, but like a proper full week or full 2 weeks chunk, because not only does that make you more relaxed as a person, I find that I'm a better attorney because of it, because it's during that time that I find that my mind of its own accord kind of wanders onto, new ideas or thinks, we've been taking this surveillance framework for granted, but man, what if we started over? What if we could just redraft all the laws? And that's nuts. But that's the kind of like creative idea that you get to have when you actually let yourself have downtime.
I completely agree with that. Taking your vacation in chunks, because having 6 long weekends is not the same as taking a whole week off. I also have started going on vacation in places my cell phone doesn't work. It's amazing.
I went to northern Quebec this summer for exactly that reason.
And I'll just add to that. It's hard when you're kind of, the lowest person on the totem pole, but as you move up, it gets a little bit easier. And, if you're at a place where you can leave at 5 and not answer emails, once you stop answering emails after a certain time, people stop sending them to you. And so that's what I found. Other questions?
This might be more geared toward recent graduates like myself. Coming into the very frustrating but shockingly common paradox where it's an entry level or junior level position, but they want like 5 years of experience already. Or as a meme that I've seen recently, we want someone who's 25 to 30 years old with 35 years experience. So, and I know earlier you were talking about skill sets and the legal abilities that you can often bring to these situations. What might you say, or what might you recommend to perhaps overcome what might be this rather intimidating barrier of, they say, we want entry level who's already been working in the field, and perhaps because except for some government positions, it's often it's not a hard cap, but it's a very visible, perhaps mental barrier. So how do you recommend sort of trying to punch through that barrier?
I think you're exactly right that many times those are aspirational and sometimes even arbitrary. Yeah. That were put in there by a recruiter and not necessarily by the hiring manager. But the other thing to keep in mind is years of experience are just a proxy for some skill set that the employer desires. And so if you can make a case that the experience you do have is relatively concentrated, relative to what others in the field might have been doing, in a year, make that case that you have what they're looking for, and that's ultimately what they should care about.
You should, definitely apply. Sometimes you get discouraged because you see, they want 5 years experience. I only have 1, so I'm not going to apply. I think you should definitely apply and make the case, as you're saying, because if you don't, then you're definitely not going to get it.
I would largely echo that. I think it's key to remember that job descriptions describe the ideal candidate that the employer would like to see. And so for me, unless it's a UN application where I'm sure I am getting screened out and I'm sure internships are not going to count or something like that, if it says 5 years and I'm sitting here going, well, I've got like 4 3/4, or I've got 4, or if it says 7 years and I've got 5, I just do it. And I think, again, for the women in the room, I think that we tend to undersell ourselves. I've read this somewhere, partly in things that our female CEO has sent around, that we tend to underrate our own qualifications. And then later, when you look back on it, you think, I was incredibly qualified for that. Why did I so downplay myself? Another thing I would say is, at least in the privacy community, it's musical chairs. And so if you can get to know people, whether through an internship or whatever, as soon as you're known, you have a much easier time. Same with, law school connections. Being able to go to someone and say, hey, I've applied for this. Could you maybe just help my resume get to the top of the pile? Is a really good thing to be able to do.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. You ask somebody, who would you want to hire, and they're going to tell you a purple-spotted unicorn with sprinkles. So that's what's going to be in the job description. They're never going to get their purple-spotted unicorn with sprinkles, but they might get someone has sprinkles, or one of the things. So think of it that way. And yeah, all they can say is no. You can try. Also, by the way, on those categories of skill sets, when it's anything basically from 2 to 6 years or so, or 2 to 7 years, that's a fuzzy range, a very, very fuzzy range. Especially, I would say, in the private sector to some degree. There has to, the skills that you have matter, but kind of the junior level person, years 1 through 3, mid-level is kind of 4 to 7, depending. There's a lot of wiggle room in there. So if you already have 1 or 2 years of experience, anything in that next bit of range, you can probably talk your way into if you talk your way right. So think of it that way.
And I'm going to jump in on this because this is something that ASIL deals a lot with. I actually travel the country and talk to law schools and law students on this exact topic, on preparing for this. So the first thing about, remember that job descriptions are wish lists, not must-haves. So never assume that you're not qualified for, just because you're not qualified for everything, you can't apply. And two, you should always be applying for a job that's a little bit out of your reach. In terms of hiring, very few people actually want someone that has all of those qualities, because odds are they're going to come in, look around, say, I know how to do all of this, and be looking for their next job. We're in a much more mobile job market than we've ever been before in the legal profession. The last thing I'd mention is in terms of identifying what skills you should be spending your time on, because right now time is one of the most difficult things you have to spend, and you have to ration it very carefully, is you should not be waiting until you graduate to look at job descriptions. You should have a collection of them, 20, 25 of them that you've looked at. Maybe they're all ones that you want to apply to. Maybe they're ones that are in the right field. It may not be the exact right organization or the right fit, or it's in a different place than you want to go. But if it's in The Hague, who cares if it's the kind of job you want? Because what you're doing is you're rating the job descriptions for what the employers actually want, what they prioritize. And if you look at all 25 of those job descriptions, and 20 of them want someone who, for a development position, has spent 2 years in country in a developing country, then that's really important. You should do that. You should spend that time. If only 5 of them want someone with an LLM, don't go and do an LLM. That's not worth your time. So use the job descriptions to prioritize what you should spend your time developing your resume around.
Hi, I'm sort of here as a ringer. So I'm not so much looking for a job in international law, but on the other side of that, and I do a lot of hiring. And the other thing I would say is that when a job description when they say that they want 2 to 5 years or whatever it is, help out the person who's reading your resume. If you actually have experience that's hidden in there that's relevant to that category, give them something so that they can check the box and say yes. If you say, I don't have X numbers of years of experience, but I have all these other wonderful qualities, you're not helping them. You're not helping yourself. So do the work and pull out what you have. Make your best case. And put it there. And everyone understands, like what Brian said, sometimes you've had more concentrated experience, or your experience is spread out over different internships, and you've had that exposure, and you can accumulate it. So go ahead and do the work and try to make the case for the person who's hiring you, rather than discounting yourself from the outset. Because sometimes the exercises aren't aspirational. Sometimes they really do want someone who has 4 years, but they're willing to be flexible about how they count that. And so, so you can do some of that work on the front end, so you don't have your resume put in the pile of, doesn't meet the basic criteria.
Yeah, don't just think of your years after law school. When you count, think of, well, if you did 3-month internships in a field, guess what? That's now, rounded up almost a year. But but I mean, count those months, because the months add up to something else. And as you said, it's the skills. So I mean, if you can point to something that you've done that could replace the postgraduate experience, help them out.
Excuse me. Good evening, everyone. My name is Saba Amare. I'm currently a senior in high school, and I'm just here because I'm interested in becoming a lawyer, hopefully, or studying political science and international relations. However, I just wanted to know if you guys had one advice as far as early on things that maybe I can keep in mind, or matter of fact, anyone that is a student could keep in mind, or do that maybe you guys didn't do, or that you experienced, and any lessons that you took on. Thank you.
First of all, good for you. I mean, you're here and you're speaking in public, and you're obviously very interested and willing to assert yourself and to come to events like this, and that's wonderful. I think that it's great that you know so early. I didn't know I wanted to be a lawyer until I realized I wanted to be a lawyer about a year before I went to law school, which was when I was about 25 or 26. Mm-hmm. So you're ahead of the game. I think that a lot of colleges have pre-law advisors. I didn't go through that system. Maybe other people in the room will be able to tell you. But I think what everyone up here has been saying is to follow your interests. When I talk to undergrads who are thinking about law school, I always say, be sure. I mean, be really sure. It's a lot of debt. Mm-hmm. And it's 3 very intense years. But so I'm always glad that by the time I went to law school, I was sure. And that meant that I enjoyed it more. I felt more confident in just taking the classes I wanted to take. I knew where I wanted to go. And I think doing internships, everyone here would probably say is really key to your professional development. If you can do it in undergrad, by all means. If not, then, the opportunity will be there when you do get to law school.
Also, there's no major that you have to take to go to law school. Right. Major in something that you want to study. You'll be happier and your grades will be better. And law schools don't care. And actually, law schools, when they say, ooh, you're a mathematics major or something like that, is actually unusual because so many people are political science or this, that, the other thing. So when you're an undergrad, don't be pressured into something pre-law.
I would just add, I think there are some cool adventures that you can have when you're, in high school or in college before you've gotten into your career track, especially if you're interested in international affairs. There are volunteer projects that you can do abroad, which don't even necessarily have to do with, clear career paths. You can go build homes for people in developing countries or something, and you go and you learn about that place and the political dynamics there, and then you read a book about it, and then there's your thesis. And so, there are a lot of neat, I think there are ways that you can volunteer for nonprofit organizations and just kind of get a flavor for what they do and see if something like that is something that you'd be interested in. So explore those opportunities. And thanks so much for joining us.
I will say one thing, though, as the job market has changed, one thing that I have been frustrated about as an observer, as a participant, as someone with friends looking for jobs, is the spread of jobs that require you to work for free. And it's incredibly unfortunate. It's really frustrating. Because life costs money. and it's very frustrating to see people that I know that would be excellent in particular jobs not be able to do them because they can't work for free. And they can't work for free for a year. I've seen this happen where jobs require you to work for free for a year. So I say this because there's actually a lot of money out there to help sponsor people to do internships in law schools and even high school students to do trips and things like that. The United States government has certain grants that they will give. Universities, of course, have these things too, but there are private entities that have money. As it was said earlier, ASIL, can give some money for students to go do things. And so go ahead and use that Google and help and look for that kind of thing. I was somebody who I remember my law school saying, hey, don't you want to go work for the ICJ? This is so perfect for you. I'm like, yes, this is perfect. Okay, I can do this and that. Oh, wait, but by the way, the ICJ mandates that you work for 6 months. And by the way, we're not going to give you any money for it. And so I had to say no. And someone else took my place. Fine. Great for them. But it's really, I find it really unfortunate because not everyone has the opportunity to volunteer, but that doesn't mean there aren't other things you can do. Also, there are things in the U.S. that you can volunteer in that you get exposure to serving international clients, working with asylum seekers, working with refugee entities in the U.S., for instance, is a great way to learn about law, see how it affects real people, but also get some of that cross-cultural experience, maybe use your language skills, things like that. So.
I feel like we say this every time we do one of these getting started, but never forget that every domestic issue is also usually got an international component to it as well. So if you're working here in the U.S. on domestic violence issues, be the person who's looking at what the international component of that is. What's going on right now about trying to get domestic violence recognized as a protection status for refugees, or what's the UN Women organization doing on domestic violence issues. If you're working on LGBT issues, those absolutely have international elements to it. So don't assume that just because you're working on something domestic, it doesn't also have an international component. And as long as you're the one driving that international interest, you can then parlay that into a knowledge about that for future employers. And many of them, you can sell this and say, look, global health and public law, or global public health law is a huge growing area of interest. Much of that revolves around knowing how global health is done in the local health organizations. So if you've worked for a county health board, you actually have a lot more that you can offer to PAHO or to WHO on, I understand how health works at the domestic level, which is really important for those policy people who have only ever engaged with it at the policy level. They don't know what it's like to have people come into the waiting room and try and explain the necessity of this shot or this vaccination or something. So don't forget those things.
Hi, everyone. My name is Laura. I was wondering if you had any suggestions for transitioning. So we know these jobs are sometimes hard to get right out of law school, but say you do find something a couple years later, 5 years, maybe even 10 years later. Any advice about how to go about that, back into an international job when you're doing something domestic?
I haven't gone through that experience, so I wouldn't be able to give any advice on that.
I feel like I've talked too much. Well, I did this a bit in the sense of, so having worked in international litigation, for lack of a better description, practice, and then clerking domestically, and then trying to convince another international litigation practice that they should hire me. There were some people who were like, so what's this domestic clerkship? What is this? Do you have ICJ? Do you have this? Not everyone, but some people were like that. And I will say that I emphasize skills. And that was the way that I convinced them. But yes, it's hard, and you'll have to sell, but it's not impossible. And the skills are transferable. Lessons learned you can take into it. And as Wes was saying, to the extent that even if you're doing something domestically, when you can have an international angle to it, reach for it, then that's what you can then highlight later in making the transition.
I feel like I've also been talking a lot, but I had the opposite experience. But so take this for what it's worth, where I was trying to go from doing international stuff, so international Skadden Fellowship at the Air Center, ICJ, and then wanting to come back to the U.S. not because I didn't want to let go of that. And it was exactly about that. It was thinking, what are the skills that I have that translate? So I hadn't done U.S. litigation, but I had done litigation for the UK benefits tribunals, and hey, it's the same skill actually. Or just writing skills, research skills, your language skills. Anything that you've been doing that does kind of go from one to the other. And I think if you're trying to go from domestic back to international, I think that having a grounding in actual practice of U.S. law or actual any kind of practice really is going to be very valuable. And a lot of positions that I have seen would like you to have that, and then just having international law knowledge is enough. Like having taken the classes, being conversant in it. I mean, not for all of them, but I've seen that.
So I think my employer, the State Department Legal Advisor's Office, is probably like the opposite of at least how I understand much of the legal market to be, which is very specialized, and as you're applying, particularly farther on, you're expected to have a very sort of well-developed expertise in a well-defined area. By contrast, my employer rotates the attorneys every few years to do something totally different, and before you come into the office, there's almost no one else outside of that office who actually does that. And so they're just looking for excellent lawyers, good people, good colleagues, and the like, with the expectation that you'll figure out the substance. And so I wouldn't, at least for us, I wouldn't sort of write yourself out of it. As everyone else has said, just give some thought and convey how all the experience you do have is an asset.
What do you mean by rotate? Do you rotate your lawyers at the State Department?
Yeah, so there's I think 23 offices.
Can you repeat the question for the recording?
Yes. So the question is, what did I mean when I said the attorneys rotate within the Office of the Legal Advisor at the State Department? So there's 23 different offices, and every few years, attorneys have the option to rotate to the different offices. So I started out actually in the Office of International Claims and Investment Disputes with an international arbitration and litigation practice, and now I'm a polar bear space lawyer. And what I will do next, I don't know. I did not know anything about polar bear space law before I became the government's expert on it.
I'll just add that if there's a specific area that you know that you want to go into, expertise is also highly valued in most places. And so if you can write an article about that aspect of law, or write a blog, or write a couple of blogs, or do something to make sure that you know what the key cases are, what the key issues are, and demonstrate that, that will be respected. Should we take maybe 1-2 more quick questions and then wrap it up?
I want to say one comment on your thing. I knew someone who worked at the ECCC, so the Extraordinary Chambers of the Courts of Cambodia, the UN War Crimes Tribunal in Cambodia, who had previously been a corporate lawyer in Chicago doing capital markets work. How did she end up there? She volunteered to do pro bono work in international criminal law. She got involved in the ABA section on criminal law, and she did every pro bono thing that she could come up with in international criminal law. And that was how she was able to transition at some point. So that's also something to think about, is if you can, if you're doing pro bono, how maybe your pro bono can be international, even if most of the work that you do is domestic.
Hi, my name is Shada, and I was curious if any of you had thoughts on how to leverage foreign law experience. So not international law, but foreign, and beyond just the skills, because obviously the skills will transfer, but like just working in a different jurisdiction.
I imagine Annalise has an answer to that question. Are there any more questions that we could just take quickly and then answer them all together? Is that all? All right.
Well, I found, unfortunately, at the time when I was looking, just having foreign law experience or a law degree from another country wasn't enough here in the U.S. market. I had to, that's why I went into and had my master's degree. I did my master's degree in order to put myself in the same playing field as everybody else. And that's really what helped me actually sell myself, was to have the master's degree. Obviously, it gives you, to have a foreign degree gives you a different perspective, especially like I'm graduated in civil law, and in the U.S. it's common law. So I was able to learn a little bit also about common law during my master's degree, and then come to the employer and say, well, I have a civil law background. I've also learned on common law, so I'm bringing that little extra that that other perhaps domestic lawyers don't have. But definitely, I think it's the case today. You do need a master's degree in the U.S. To be able to find a job in this area.
Just to clarify, I have a U.S. JD, so I was curious more about like the post side.
I was curious more about the post-law school. So all my experience post my JD has been foreign. So I was kind of curious about now how to leverage that post. Yeah, but that was, thank you.
I think even better. If you have the JD and you have the foreign law, I think that'll help you definitely in the searching a job here in the U.S.
I'm trying to figure out how to extrapolate from my own experience, because I actually do still do foreign law. I do still do some UK law, and actually I did an amicus in a French case that we're actually, it's the song that doesn't end, it just goes on forever. It's being translated. I keep thinking it's done and it's not. Yeah, and I think that for me, take from this what you will, but I can just go to my employer and say, the GCHQ in the UK is the NSA's closest surveillance partner. You have someone in your office who has some experience in UK law. Don't you think it would be advantageous to put that person and have them practice like some comparative law? And so that's, for me at least, again, in the nonprofit field, you wind up with more flexibility, I think, sometimes to define what it is that you do. And so I've been able to leverage it both ways. And so if you have experience in both, which I think is fantastic, then you can, at least in this field, pull in elements of whatever your experience is. Because if it is something as, a skill that's commonly needed, like UK law, like EU law, then you can often find ways to work that in.
But if you are initially on the job market and looking for a job, chances are there's probably a law firm or an NGO or some sort of organization that works in the region of the country in which you have your experience. And so even if they're not looking for people particularly with that skill set, that is certainly, you would be very attractive to them because you have a base knowledge and familiarity with the legal culture and the way the laws work. And inevitably at some point, they can imagine that they're going to need someone with that skill, and then you'll already be there.
I would like to thank very much our panel of polar bear space law experts, trilinguists, novelists, monster movie fanatics, and international lawyers. Thank you so much for sharing your insights.